Okay, thanks, Sharon. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for spending a little time with us this afternoon to talk about interview preparation. As Sharon said, I'm Kristin Staunton. I've been here with Dietrich College working in the Career and Professional Development Center for about 5 years now. Previously, I was on the talent acquisition and recruitment side, so this is one of my favorite presentations to give because I do have a lot of experience as an interviewer. And I'm also really excited today to introduce Katie Flanagan. Katie just started with us, gosh, about 10 days ago. And she will also be advising all of you as graduate students of Dietrich College. So I'm going to let Katie say a few words. Before we do move into the presentation, I just want to again reiterate that we would love to have your participation. So please, you can feel free to ask questions at any time, interrupt us. We don't mind. If you would rather save it for the end, we will have some time for a Q&A there as well. Okay, Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, fantastic. So as I said, my name is Katie Flanagan, and I am the newest career consultant coming from several years in the higher education career services space. So I'm very excited to get to know you all over these webinars and hopefully in future advising appointments. So since we do have a small group here, I would love to hear your thoughts just because we want to make sure that this is tailored to each of you and what you're hoping to get out of the presentation today. So whether in the chat or even if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to share something you would like to learn or perhaps a challenge that you have faced when preparing or being in an interview. I'll give you a minute to put that in the chat. Or like I said, feel free to unmute. We won't bite. Okay, I see negotiation, which is a great hot topic for us later on in a couple weeks as well. Yes, Jack. We definitely want you to feel confident coming out of this, and sometimes it's a state of mind, but also make sure you have the research and the practice behind you as well. Okay, third-party recruiters. So Kristin might have a good perspective of this coming from the recruiting background.
Yeah, we can touch on that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, spinning experience as in tailoring it and making it relevant. Absolutely important. We can talk about that too. Okay, and how to respond when a potential employer doesn't recognize the value of academic experience. Gotcha. Yeah, so making sure that your projects, your research is being made known in your skill set. So, all right, fantastic. Thank you all for sharing. And it sounds like we have some crossovers here, but asking good questions. We will definitely go over that too. So awesome, thanks.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we wanted to cover was just thinking through the purpose of an interview. And there's really, two parties in every interview, and both of those parties sort of have their own purpose. So thinking, from, again, the perspective of the employer, they are there because they are looking to evaluate and validate the skills that they see on your resume. They obviously are hoping to hire the best possible candidate, someone who fits well into their corporate culture and team dynamics, and someone who has long-term potential. But also keep in mind that you are there with your own purpose. You know, maybe the obvious one is that you want to really make sure to display your strengths and qualifications for a particular position. But you also want to, you know, use this time to determine whether this job or internship is going to fulfill your professional aspirations. Is it going to be a positive environment for you to work in? You know, does the job align with your personal and professional values? And will you be able to do meaningful work? So just keep some of these things in mind when you're preparing how to answer questions, and also when you're preparing what questions to ask. You know, the employers do have expectations. And so it's also important to kind of think about what those might be going into the interview, so that you can make your best first impression right away. So in order to meet some of these expectations, you know, keep in mind, you know, nonverbal things. So they're expecting you to be on time, and on time actually means a few minutes early, right? They're expecting eye contact, whether that's an in-person job interview or, you know, these days more likely to be a virtual interview. Your body language, your mannerisms, confidence, as I think it was Jack had mentioned. Whether you're in person or across from the screen, they're going to be expecting you to be dressed professionally and listening. And then, you know, on the more traditional verbal side of things, they're expecting you to have, to exhibit and to have an interest in and knowledge of the position that you're applying to, an understanding of your own strengths and opportunities. And then they're going to expect you to be able to communicate these things effectively using specific examples and stories. They're expecting honesty, and they're expecting, you know, at the end, some questions from you as a way of showing interest, and then a thank you note after the process is finished.
All right, and so interviews can kind of fall into these general buckets that you see on the screen here. So behavioral and presentation will go into further detail today, since those tend to be a little bit more common, whereas case interviews and technical interviews tend to be for more specific types of positions. For example, case interviews could be for consulting, and technical interviews could be you might have heard of like a coding challenge, or maybe a whiteboard interview where you're answering and problem solving. So we have a lot of resources that we can provide you on that, and I'll drop them in the chat here in a little bit. If you do happen to be looking at a case or technical interview, and of course our other interviews too. All right, next please, thank you. So when we look at some typical types of interview questions, we'll go over several different types here today. They tend to, again, fall into different categories. So specific questions, for example, what were your major responsibilities during your summer internship? So it's very to the point. Behavioral based, which we will kind of break down a little bit today. Can you recall a time when you were a member of a team and there was conflict in the group? So it's an opportunity for you to share a specific example or a story that will help you reveal the skill set that you have. And then situational. So basically, what would the ideal situation be if you were in this particular context? So what would you do if a client shared that they were dissatisfied with the service they were receiving from your company? And then lastly, technical and industry. So very specific to a skill set that would be required for that job. So describe your experience with statistical software.
Okay, great. Any questions? I know we covered a lot, but before we move on, I'll just pause for a second, and we will go into behavioral interviewing in a lot more detail in a few minutes. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you know if there are certain types of questions that aren't actually about the surface question, but something that requires you to read between the lines or understand some implication?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you're asking. Can you give me an example?
Oh, I don't know of an example. I'm really bad at that. But so like I don't know, someone asks some kind of question, but really they're trying to get at a different source of information.
So I've definitely heard of companies asking like what they might call like brain teaser questions or logic questions
Oh yeah.
to try
Patience,
to,
yeah.
you know, to try to suss out your ability to think, you know, analytically, to sort of get your basic understanding of like a market or, you know, common sense knowledge. Those used to be more common. And I don't know if you're aware, but Google wrote like a pretty famous book about their recruiting process. And Google actually used to use a ton of these questions. And then they had all this evidence and made a case for the fact that those questions were not actually very, very tied to a candidate's eventual success on the job. So after Google published that book, a lot of companies stopped using those types of questions or use them less frequently. But I do see them come up, still come up sometimes in consulting industries, in financial services industries, but less frequently.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Katie.
This is an outlandish example, but a question that was actually asked to me in the past was like, what type of cereal would you be in? Why? So you could, I mean, if they're a creative bunch, perhaps they might ask something outlandish because they don't really want to know what kind of cereal I could be, but they care more about like explaining your reasoning. So that's a skill set in its own, or your creativity. So does that kind of fit what you were thinking, Krista?
Yeah, that fits pretty well. And also what Patience mentioned about what are your weaknesses, for example, you're not actually supposed to reply with your weaknesses, right? So, I mean,
Right.
Yeah, we will get to that for sure.
Or I would ask a question, like I don't ask people what are their weaknesses, but I might ask,
yeah.
you know, I'm hiring a teacher. I would say, well, you know, part of my job as the director is to provide for your professional development. So what are the areas that you would most like to have professional development in the next year or two? And presumably they would choose things that they don't know as much about, or they would like to know more about. They might not say, well, I'm a horrible communicator, and so I need communication training, presumably. But it does help me assess whether they have a reflection, or if they basically have no ideas, then they're not really probably the kind of learner that I want. Like I'm trying to hire the people who are leaving their current job because it's not challenging enough. It's not providing that professional development for them. But if they can't even think of one thing to tell me that they would want professional development, then I probably don't want them. So it's not necessarily a weakness. Or other questions that you ask a really broad thing, but you kind of want certain answers. Like when I ask, you know, you're going to work as part of a team. What do you think are the most important things to help a team function well? I kind of in my mind, like if they don't mention communication, that tells me something. But if I asked about communication, they would tell me about communication. So I don't ask about communication. I ask about what's going to help your team function well. Does that make sense? So it's not
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
It's not trying to be a trick. It's just that if they don't think of that, if you ask too specific a question, you don't know what they would come up with on their own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. So we're going to start by talking about the professional introduction, which is often how an interview will open up. So everybody kind of dreads this question, but it almost always comes up, and that is, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. And so when you're answering this question, you know, you want to have, you know, a structure and a framework for your answer, because you don't want to go through your entire resume. You don't want this answer to be like 10 minutes long. You want to try to keep it between like a minute and 2 minutes. And essentially you'll start by introducing yourself, usually your area of current study, what year you are, what major you are, and maybe some relevant skills or experiences. You're a grad student, so if it makes sense, you know, to also touch upon your previous degree, certainly do that. But then the really important piece is to connect the dots. So discuss how your background and your current work will help you to be successful in this position. It's also fine to bring in some personal stories. I think it makes, it can make for an interesting answer. So if you want to say, in my free time, I also, enjoy writing comic books and teaching yoga, that just gives more color to your character. And it's fine to do that. But what they're really interested in is, how is your current work and your interests relevant and connected to this position? This is something that's really easy to practice, and practice does help you to present a better answer. It's something that you'll use all the time. So not just in interviews, but when you're at networking events, when you're at career fairs, this is pretty much how every conversation is going to open up. So it's definitely worth spending the time to prepare it. And, Katie and I can help you with that. And would be happy to do so. But this is more one that really is about you, right? So you're not going to find the answer to this in any of our interviewing resources. This one's about you. Okay. And then the other thing is, discussing your interest in the job. This is something that is also going to come up, because employers genuinely care about why you're pursuing this position and what your motivation is. So, looking at some of the responses to this question, why are you interested in this opportunity? Does anyone have a guess as to which of these might be the strongest response? You can just throw it in the chat. All right, we have a 3 and a 2. Twos. Yeah, it actually is number 2. And the reason for that is just that it's a little more specific. So, the more you can bring your knowledge of what is going to be required of you in the job into your answer, it just shows that you are prepared to actually do this job. You understand, what your responsibilities are going to be. You are, you're interested in the company's product. You're interested in the company's culture. And so just, adding a little more detail than number 3, would be the best answer here.
All right. And another interviewing staple, as we've already proclaimed, is the behavioral kinds of questions. And so these are intended to predict future behavior based on past behavior. So the stories that you share, the examples that you give, are generally a good indicator of the behavior that you might do again when it relates to, for example, a time you tried something new or worked as part of a team or overcame a challenge. So anytime you hear something along the lines of "give me an example of," or "tell me about a time," that should be like your little red flag going off that, okay, I'm ready to give a behavioral based answer through my story. And so kind of as it says here, it's your greatest hits. You want to pick a story that relates to the position as much as possible, or shows the best version of yourself. Of course, you're not exaggerating. You are telling the story of what you specifically did. I bring that up because sometimes we get students who share, something that their team did, but ultimately it's your actions and your behaviors that they want to see. And I see Sharon has raised her hand.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, obviously it's better if they have a story from a professional context, but what do you think about stories from another context if they don't have something? Like,
yes.
Think of a project where you X, what if it was when they were volunteering that they did that project, or not necessarily in a job or in a academic context?
Yes, and that was actually something I was just about to bring up too. So thanks, Sharon. So typically it kind of goes from a work or internship experience first. If you don't have something that relates, then think about student organizations or volunteer experience. And then think of classroom projects or anything academic related. So it's totally fine if you weren't in that type of situation at an internship at a job or in a grad assistantship. So it's okay to think back and find what the best fit is for you in that particular example. Yeah, great point. Next slide, please.
Can I ask about how to develop your greatest hits list for this? Like, should I spend some time reflecting on my whole life and
it doesn't have to be your whole life.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that. I would say recent and relevant tends to be the goal.
Okay.
And the way to create this greatest hits list is through what you see on the screen here, the STAR response.
Okay, great.
So that stands for situation, task, action, result. And so this is the go-to surefire way to respond to tell me about a time when, or give me an example of. And so the situation that you would create when you tell this story is the context. So, you know, I was in my internship at Apple, or I was in my data science class, you know, whatever the context is for you, just so the people who are listening can visualize the things that you're talking about. So we want to know as much detail as possible so we can literally picture you doing these things. And so what was it, when was it, who was involved? And then you go into your tasks and actions. So much like I said earlier, what did you specifically do? You might have been assigned to something by someone else, and that's the task, but what did you do to actually carry it out? And perhaps how did you interact with other people to make that happen? And then lastly, the results. So this is probably the most important yet most forgotten part of this answer, our formulaic way of answering questions. So the results is, how did it turn out for you? So, you know, did you increase engagement by 25%? You know, if you can give stats, that's fantastic. If it's more of a qualitative type of thing, that's okay too. If it's a question where let's say it's, tell me about a time when you failed, what did you learn from that experience? So, you know, going into the future, the next time you face this particular situation, you know not to do X, Y, and Z. So whatever the positive or negative result is, make sure that you make that known, because that connects the real skill or behavior that you're indicating. And much like Kristin said, these are also 90-second, 2-minute responses. So, you know, be detailed enough, again, to get your point across, but you don't have to explain the whole organizational chart that made things possible.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, practice, practice, practice. These can also be helpful to write down. I think, you know, once you start writing something down, you can quickly see where you might be going off on a tangent, or where maybe there's a missing piece to your story.
Right, and this can be like your little cheat sheet. Let's say if you want to write it down or put it in an Excel and literally write STAR and think about some of the most common questions you could get based on the skills in the job description, and then write out your example, so that way you can practice it. Cool. Questions on that? Hopefully that helps with some of the greatest hits patients. Awesome.
Okay, so this is probably a bit of a rhetorical question, but I'm going to show you 2 example answers to the question, tell me about a time you used effective communication skills. It's probably pretty obvious which one of these is the better answer, but maybe we can talk about why. So what do you see in answer number 2 that's missing from answer number 1? Or what do you think makes answer number 2 appealing to a recruiter? Oh, I could check the chat. Right, specific details. Yes. So you really want that recruiter to, as Katie said, come away with sort of almost like a visual in their mind of you doing this thing or exhibiting this skill. And in order for them to have that, they have to have that detail, or else they're not going to remember you and you're not going to stand out from other candidates. It's also a way for them to, validate your skill set, as we said on that first slide. So, unfortunately, it can be fairly easy to sort of, fake it on a resume, but when you have to really start talking about your skills in a specific format, it's much harder to do that. And that's the reason that these questions are asked. So the more detail you can give while staying in that STAR framework, the better. All right, thanks everybody.
And that answer is really very short to speak. Like it's
right.
It's not long, but it has a ton of detail packed into a short space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this one I would say, I would guarantee that the person who wrote this, who said this answer probably wrote it down first, right? You can see with something like this, that it would really be hard to just kind of say something like that on the fly. And that's why practice is so important. Another way to get those greatest hit stories prepared is to look at your job description, right? This is going to be your key to what the greatest hits will be for any particular position. And so I'll give you a minute to just look at this job description. This is for a real job as a content creator at a luggage company called Away. So you can read through the responsibilities and the qualifications. And then I'll ask if anybody has ideas for what types of behavioral questions this recruiter might ask. So I'll kick us off. I would guess that one question might be, tell me about a time that you worked as part of a team to accomplish a task or a project. What was your role on that team and what was the result? So I got that question from the second bullet point, right? Collaborating with other brand marketing teams to develop content. So remember, they're looking for past behaviors as a way to predict future performance on the job. Any other ideas for what this recruiter might ask? Well, there we go. I lost my cursor. Tell me about a time that you were creative. Yeah, Kristin, that's a great idea. Tell me about a time that you, maybe had to use creativity to solve a problem, or tell me, depending on the job, tell me about a creative writing piece that you're particularly proud of. Perfect. And then patience suggests, tell me about a time you've gone above and beyond and what was asked of you. I was going to come up with that one too, because there's that line, working with a no task is too small mentality. So yes, tell me about a time when you, when you accomplished something that was not within your job description. What was it? How did you accomplish it? So these are great ideas, and I think you guys are getting the hang of it. Let's see, were there any others? All right.
All right, now it is your turn for all of you to really hone in and think about your own individual skills. And so what exercise we're going to do is think about the 6 skills that you see up here, because these are all quite common in job descriptions or in interviews, and then select one of them for today. And obviously it would be good to prep the other ones in the future, but for now, pick one and then think of a star-based example, that situation, task, action, result, and then how you have an experience that reflects the skill that you picked. So maybe it would be helpful to go back to the star screen. Perfect. Yeah, so communication, teamwork, conflict management, flexibility, problem solving, or overcoming a challenge or failure. So pick one of those and then create your star response.
Katie, can you say them one more time? I'll put the skills in the chat. So
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Communication, teamwork, conflict management, flexibility, problem solving, or overcoming a challenge or failure. Perfect. In the meantime, I'm going to put some links in the chat for our other resources we were talking about earlier, and we'll give you 3 to 4 minutes to come up with that. If you want to do multiple ones, that's awesome too. And then we'll share them out. Okay, we'll give 1 more minute just to wrap things up. If you have extra time, feel free to add a second example, maybe from a different place of work or internship or a project. And in the meantime, in the chat, we have resources for technical interviews, consulting / case interviews, and then additional resources for later on. All right. So if anyone wants to be confident and unmute themselves and share out how they might respond. So in this case, you can just say, my situation is this, my task is this, actions and results. But when you're actually interviewing, you don't have to say those things. I wouldn't say those things necessarily.
If we were in person, we'd have a big bag of candy and be tempting like volunteers with chocolate, but we don't have that. So we just need.
We'll be kind.
Very kind.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Sorry, I had my video off as I was eating dinner, but not sure if this is just the example that I thought of. But for communication, I chose my sort of star story to be my first year milestone project, which is the first sort of big evaluation that happens in my program. And so you present on a project that you've done to a sort of evaluation committee and also to the public. So the main people involved were me and my rotation advisor. And so I had to, put together all the results and why they were meaningful and lay them out in a way that was digestible. And to really to really do well, I had to start very early, and I practiced multiple times with myself and with my advisor and with one lab actually. Like I had a practice presentation and a bunch of people gave me feedback, and from all of that preparation, I could give a really confident presentation, and I got pleasant feedback from my evaluation committee, and it was just a good experience.
All right. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, my one suggestion would be, maybe even give a little more detail into that like middle stage of feedback. So when you got the initial feedback, what was it? And then, what steps did you take to improve on your communication before that final feedback? Because I think that's an important detail.
Thank you.
But it's a great example to use, and I think it works really well for the communication point.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the situation of providing the context, because not everyone knows what your milestone is about, was incredibly helpful.
Can I ask a question about the conflict one?
Sure.
So I feel like what they want to hear is a time when there was a conflict and you were the one who resolved it. But what about an example where you're in a conflict and you manage it well? I feel like I don't know. Those are the examples I can think of in professional situations, and those are a little bit tricky for me to figure out how to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it could be either that they ask. I think managing conflict is the ultimate goal in those questions. So whether you were the one like engaging in the conflict or you helped separate a conflict, I think either of those instances can be helpful in this case.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it would be nice to see some like real examples of an answer to a question like that, because I feel like, for me at least, it's one of those topics where I might kind of go, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I feel like with conflicts, it's kind of, there's like this emotionally fraught aspect of it that makes it a little bit tricky to talk about. And I know that like writing down a response, but I guess I feel like a lot of realistic conflicts, the end result is that like nothing worse happened as opposed to like, and then we, something beautiful came out of it. So I have I'm struggling with like kind of composing that structure for the conflict question.
And I do think that they're not so much looking for that resolution at the end as they are to like how do you approach conflict? Do you avoid it? You know, do you confront somebody? If you do confront them, like in what manner? Is it, you know, is it an aggressive confrontation? Are you, you know, questioning them? Is it more of a mediation between other people on the team? I think it's okay if it doesn't resolve.
Right.
You
So
know,
kind of speaking about it in a way that shows your general approach to managing conflict. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
As someone hiring, I would also want to know what resources did you utilize? So when the conflict began, maybe you tried resolving it yourself and that wasn't successful. So you sought help from someone or you consulted someone, tried another step. Like, even if it doesn't come to a resolution, if at least you sort of took the reasonable steps would be what I would be looking for, because you can only control half of the situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, but you bring up a good point about it being potentially emotionally charged, and you know, in an interview, it's not that you don't want to get caught up in reliving past trauma if it were that case. So I would say, you know, pick an example that does show what Sharon just said, but you know, is enough to demonstrate your approach.
Would anyone else like to share an answer with us? On the spot feedback. Nobody wants any feedback? All right. We won't force you. But we do, maybe this will be the time when I plug that we do offer mock interviews. So if you'd rather do this one-on-one, totally understand. And, you know, Katie and I can actually tailor questions if you send us the job description, and we can practice, you know, as a team. All right. But thanks, Jack, and thanks all of you for your good questions.
And I'm just going to encourage you to take them up on this suggestion, because, you know, when you practice with your advisor and your research team, they're sort of so in your court that they almost assume some things that in a job interview wouldn't be known about you. So I think it's really good to practice with someone who's objective, who doesn't know you so well. And those people might be hard to come by in your own personal life. So take advantage of Kristin and Katie when they offer these things. That's their job. They're here for you.
All right, thanks, Sharon. And we are going to move on now from talking about behavioral questions. But I will say, I also do have a long list of sample questions. So if anyone would like to have that as another additional resource, it's not on our website, but I often can, you know, do send it out to students. So moving on from behavioral, we're going to touch briefly on presentations. This is becoming more common, I think, as an interview type, and its purpose is, you know, kind of threefold, really. You know, the hiring team or hiring committee is looking at your communication skills. They're also looking at your knowledge or expertise of a certain topic or skill, and your ability to present that information while staying calm, organizing your information well, and you know, perhaps putting together a slide deck or other visuals to help your presentation. So, you know, if you do get asked to do this, you will be given a very specific call to action. They may give you the freedom to choose a project or, you know, a piece of research to present on. They may actually give you something. So they may make something up and say, you know, pretend that you're a content creator for Away. Put together a new email marketing campaign and 5 social media posts that you know, would use to promote our new product. So, you know, when you're doing this, if you are asked to choose your own project, you want to consider what you choose carefully. You want to think about what skills the job description requires, and which of your projects or research would best exemplify those skills or that subject matter expertise. You also want to really think about the way you're organizing your information. And again, practice. So they will give you a time. So you'll know whether it's a 15-minute or a 30-minute or a 45-minute presentation. They will also likely tell you who the audience is and whether you're supposed to, present to a, pretend client, or whether you're just presenting this information to the hiring committee. But regardless, the actual presentation of the information is important. So the way that you're organizing things and what you're presenting on, if you're sharing a screen, what you're showing. Bringing in elements that are specific to a company or specific to a company's project really makes a big difference. So anytime you can tie your research or your work to something that's going on at that company, that makes a big difference. And certainly if you get asked to do a presentation, definitely make an appointment with us to practice. We can help you put these together. And they can actually be fun. You kind of have the audience's captive attention, and you get to really show everything that you've learned in your program. So it can be, I think it's a fun part of the interview process if you do get asked to do it. Right. Any questions about presentations before we move on?
I was just going to say, I think it's actually also a really good part of what you learned from the interview, because how they respond to your presentation and the questions they ask gives you a really good idea. And I guess I'm thinking mostly about academic, but I bet it would be the same in industry. The kind of dialogue that there is, and if they're treating you too much with kid gloves, then you probably don't want it. If they're also being too aggressive in their questions, that's not necessarily great. But for me, I would want someone who's willing to challenge, but in sort of a professionally good way, and would make me think oh, I'll learn from these people, or I'd want these people as my colleagues to give me feedback on my ideas. So just remember that you talked at the beginning about it's a two-way street. Everything you do is a two-way street. What do you learn from the questions they ask, the way they respond to your presentation, et cetera, as well as what are you showing them?
Great point. Thank you.
All right. So we just happened to bring this up earlier, talking about what are your biggest strengths, what are your biggest weaknesses. Sometimes they might ask a question that says, what are your top strengths that relate to this position, or what are 3 weaknesses that you have? So sometimes they ask for multiple, sometimes it's just one. So just kind of keep that in mind first and foremost. And this isn't necessarily to reveal all of your personal negativities about yourself by any means. It's more or less to see, what is the perception of the fit to this particular role, and are you able to be self-aware to know what your strengths and weaknesses are? That's absolutely important when bringing yourself into a new role, to know where the gaps are, where you need to grow, and that's perfectly okay. So I would say, ensure that you know that it relates to a particular piece of the description. So remember what we saw in that earlier job description, things that they were looking for. So if you name a weakness that is specifically their top skill that they're looking for, then that's not going to work out so well in your favor. So make sure that you're understanding what is important to them, but also providing examples. So, if you provide this strength or a weakness, then with the weakness, you can talk about an opportunity and how you can improve upon that, or if it's a strength, how you actually utilize that strength. All right. And so just to kind of expand out on that a little bit more of the do's and don'ts. So like I said, don't use this as a strength as a weakness. So I'm a perfectionist, which in this case, you're saying that you do everything so amazing that you don't have a weakness. That's kind of how it reads off to people. Or for example, I can't say no. So think about, yes, I care too much. Great example, patience. So instead, think about how you can improve on these things. So maybe if public speaking skills is something you're not comfortable with and is your weakness, maybe you present like I'm going to volunteer to present on behalf of my group. So that is a very active way to show that you are trying to work on whatever that weakness is. Or I'm utilizing Coursera, so they're taking classes to improve. They're putting themselves out there. Yeah, the I'm too reliable is another great example of the strength as a weakness. And then think about, as I said earlier, don't use a weakness that's critical to the job unless they specifically ask you to. So, if you're applying for a role that requires strong attention to detail, then you don't want to say, I don't have attention to detail. Same thing with a teamwork related position, and you say you hate working on teams, then that's not going to work out so well for you. And then don't disclose things that are irrelevant. So if you're just sharing out a weakness that has nothing to do with the job at all, then it just seems like you're avoiding the question altogether. So instead, focus on some things that could be helpful later on in the future. So the things that you would avoid, for example, I don't have strong proficiency in German if it's a position where you would never use German in this case.
Questions about strengths and weaknesses before we move on?
One thing I see in some people is that they're not talking about their weaknesses, but they think out loud in a way that shows their weaknesses. So like they'll answer a question and then they're like, oh, I really should have done that differently, or I really like they're like their internal self-talk is coming out. Or like they'll say an answer and then they'll say, oh, that wasn't really a very good answer. Like, don't say that. Like, keep your internal talk internal, because it starts showing that you're not confident, or those kind of things.
And if you need a minute to think, take a minute to think,
Yeah.
and it's okay to say that, to say, do you mind if I take a minute or two just to think of my response? That's okay. It may feel awkward, but it's pretty common in an interview, and recruiters will appreciate your thoughtfulness rather than hearing you think out loud, as Sharon was saying.
That's why a lot of people say, that's a really good question, or that's a challenging question, because that itself is giving them, like, if you feel like you need a space filler, time filler, you could use something like that to give yourself the moment to pause.
Okay, so we are going to, just briefly touch on the types of interviews. These 4 are happening now currently. Phone interviews are probably less common now that everybody is so proficient in Zoom and in other forms of video chat. But you may still encounter an employer who wants to do that initial screening by phone. And so that's usually like a 30-minute phone call where they will touch on your experiences, maybe some of your skills on a pretty high level, and then they'll tell you more about the job. Anything beyond that initial screening these days is either done through Zoom or in person. So, we're all comfortable using Zoom, pros and cons to that, I suppose. I have heard of a few students who have had in-person interviews so far this semester, but not very many. I don't know anyone who's actually like flown for an on-site visit yet. And now that companies realize they don't have to spend that kind of money, I don't know that they're going to go back to doing that. I kind of feel like the video interview is here to stay. And so we're going to, spend some time talking about how to prepare for that. I will quickly mention this third bullet point, the HireVue. This is usually like, I'll call it the dreaded HireVue because everybody hates it, but it's what we call an asynchronous video interview. And it's when you log into a system like HireVue is the most common, and you just answer questions to yourself. There's no one else on the other line. They're just recording your answers to some, usually it's 3 to 4 standard questions that everybody gets. So you usually will not know what those questions are in advance, but most companies will give you a second chance. So if you completely screw up, you'll have an opportunity to re-record your answer. That being said, I don't know anyone who loves these. They're for whatever reason, they're really intimidating. It can feel weird to just talk into into space and not really get any feedback about how you're doing through the other person's facial expressions. The good news is that HireVue has a lot of great resources on their website to help you prepare. We can also help you prepare for those, and I'm going to demo a resource that's particularly helpful in preparing for those as well. Another just a side note is that we do have interview rooms in the CPDC Interview Center. So Katie and I are in West Wing on the 2nd floor if you need to have an advising appointment. If you have a video interview and you need a quiet space or a space that's not cluttered up, you can reserve one of these rooms by emailing Recruit. They do not have computers in them though, so you have to bring your own laptop. Okay, so with a virtual interview, maybe by now that we're in 2022, this is obvious, but I'll just go ahead and touch on it anyway. These are the 3 most common video interview setup mistakes, right? You either have a light behind you, which makes your entire face wash out into a dark shadow, or we can only see like your nose up, or, please don't lie on the couch for your interview. Not a good look. So, this is ideally what we're going for, right? Shoulders up, good lighting, nothing offensive or cluttered in the background, and dressed professionally. Other, tips, definitely prepare early. So don't log in a minute before the interview starts because you want to make sure that your lighting is okay, your camera angle is, positioned at eye level. I have seen students doing interviews in their bedrooms, and while I think we don't all have the luxury of having a huge house or apartment where we have other space, you're in a dorm room, but now that we are back on campus, I would suggest if you can to reserve an interview room if the only other option is to see your bed in the background. And then the eye contact is important. It's really hard to make a connection through a screen, right? When it's just a flat image. And so you really have to take advantage of the nonverbal cues and techniques that you can use to do that. Eye contact is one of them. Being like a little extra is another. So that employer wants to hire somebody who's excited about the job. And if you're kind of looking down and mumbling and no one can hear what you're saying and looking off to the side, how are they supposed to know that you're excited to be here? So smile more, talk a little louder, talk a little slower than maybe you normally would. And I promise it makes a big difference. And until we're back in person, that's really all you can do.
Yeah, so as we're thinking about the virtual space, sometimes it can be an advantage to your ability to prepare. So you can have your resume in front of you, you can have notes in front of you, you can type up your notes, you can even have some of your star examples right there in front of you if you wanted to have them on your screen or perhaps on a nearby sheet. So whatever you can do to kind of prompt yourself in that space. So if you hear some of those keywords that we were talking about earlier, then that might be a good way just to kind of get started in that conversation. Absolutely make sure that you're taking notes, whether you are in person or if you are virtual, that you have the means to do that, because maybe a question comes up that you want to remember to ask about later, or maybe someone made a really good point that you want to include in your thank you note later on. So whatever it is that can help you remember on both sides of preparation, but also in the conversation that you're having, you can absolutely do so. I guess on the phone end, obviously no one can see the notes that you're doing, so you kind of have a more free reign in that case. But if you are talking to somebody, you know, screen to screen or face to face at some point, then make sure that you are adapting to each of those situations. And with that being said, it's meant to be more of a way to get started. You don't need to write out your entire STAR story, because then either it's going to look like you're actually reading off of something, you may be reading off of something, or that you might sound a little more robotic or over rehearsed, one or the other typically. So just keep that in mind. And as Kristin said earlier, you know, those non-verbal cues are very important. So the smiling, the eye contact, the body language, you know, kind of keeping your shoulders open, that you don't cross your arms or anything that would indicate that you're closed off from having the conversation that you're having. Remember that there's a human on the other side, so they are feeling these things, even if it doesn't seem as natural as it would in person. And then actually we just talked about this, you know, if you need time for questions, that's totally okay. Don't feel pressured to fill in silence ever. So if you do need a couple seconds to think about a response rather than blurting out the first thing that comes to mind, absolutely make sure that you get that time. Same thing if the person interviewing you is taking notes, it's okay to give them the time to do that before they ask their next question. You don't have to keep adding more just because they're not looking at you. So all of that being said, it kind of goes back to those verbal and nonverbal cues, but you want to feel as comfortable as possible in this kind of situation, even though, you know, you might feel like you're being put on the spot. But remember, this is a two-way conversation. You're interviewing them as well. And so that leads to the next slide about asking questions. So because they asked you a bunch of questions, now it is your turn to return that. Never say, no, I don't have any questions, because that is an automatic turn off that you're disinterested or you didn't do your research. So instead, you know, spend the time ahead of the interview writing out a list of questions. I usually say at least 5 to 10, because they might answer some of them as you go along, and you don't want to come up short that you're like, oh, you already answered all of them, thanks. So instead, think about questions that relate to your values. So what would be your non-negotiables if that's flex time, if that is something about the work environment, something about the mission of the place that you're interested in, whatever it is that you need to learn to make sure that it's the best fit for you, that's what you can ask. So for example, we have some types of questions up here. So is there a typical career path? So, you know, if you're interested in thinking about career projections in the future, how are projects allocated? So, you know, are they dividing tasks evenly amongst people, for example? How would you describe the company's corporate culture? So culture is usually a pretty big question that people tend to ask. Sometimes you can feel that throughout the interview, but it's a lot harder in a virtual space. So the more that you can ask questions that relate to the culture, instead of just asking, how do you describe your culture? That might be more beneficial too. Do employees socialize with each other? So if the social aspect is important to you, Could you tell me about your performance review? So again, about getting feedback if that's important to you, and then how is success measured? So, you know, do you have to reach a certain quota to continue on with your job? You know, those are important things just to know up front. As we're in the pandemic, you might ask about safety measures that the company's taken, or you know, how are they communicating? Is Zoom their typical way to go? Do they communicate on Slack instead? So what's the norm for them? And then think about the company as it is, our organization as it is right now. So what are their challenges that they're facing currently? Because challenges from a couple of years ago might not even be something they're thinking about at this point. So the more that you can kind of unearth some of those trends or news that's happening, that can help prompt some of those questions as well. Kristin and Sharon, any other common questions that you like to ask?
Well, I was going to ask you for the questions not to ask. Like, what's not on this list? For example, a very common question I get, and I just don't like it. It's like too low level. It's like, well, what's the dress code here?
Dress code, yeah, any of those low
level questions that you're going to find out if you get the job. Like, it's not.
Don't ask what your salary is going to be or how many vacation days you're going to get in that first interview. Those are questions that you'll have with HR at the end of the process if you're close to getting an offer. But that's, you know, you never want someone to think that that's the primary motivation for you, is what you're going to be paid or how much vacation time you're going to get. And that's important, but not in that first interview.
Well, and just any I think these questions are so nice because they actually show the level of your thinking. And if everything you ask is a very like detailed, low level question, then that's what they're going to take away, is that's all she's thinking about, or the only level of thinking she can do.
Right. And I absolutely agree with the examples brought up so far. I think too, just like what will my hours be, or basically yes, no, one answer kinds of questions. To those I would generally avoid.
Okay, yeah, we should probably go. We have a resource we want to demo, so I think we'll just quickly touch on the thank you note and just say that it's really important. Right, I mean, if you can write a thank you note within 24 hours, obviously we're talking about an email because otherwise they won't get it in time. But make sure that you know the names of the people you interview with, you know their email address, and that in that thank you note, it's really nice to mention something specific that you talked about. Also, don't send the same exact email to 5 different people that you interviewed at that company, because thank you notes or thank you emails get passed around. So every time that we interview someone, I can see the thank you note that they sent to everyone else on the team. And if it's the exact same note, it just shows, like, you know, that you're not being particularly thoughtful, or that you didn't remember anything that was discussed. Katie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you hit all the main areas, but the more, I would say just do it. That's the main advice. Yeah. Don't forget it.
Yeah, it can make a difference. If there are 2 candidates who are very, very close in terms of qualifications and performance in the interview process, that thank you note can be the deciding factor. I've seen it happen. Okay, so we want to show you an awesome resource before we leave today. And so I'm going to pop out of the presentation and just do a quick demo. So this is Big Interview. You all have access to this in Handshake. If you go into Handshake and then your resources tab, Big Interview is one of those resources. CMU pays a lot of money for you to be able to use this, so take advantage of it while you're a current student. And as long as you create your account with that Andrew ID, you have access to everything. So very quickly, you can see on the dashboard, we have everything from introductory videos, practice sessions, practice questions for specific positions. There is an AI feedback tool that I'll mention in a second. There is an answer builder. So I think it was it patients who asked, like, I need help putting together a response for this conflict question. The answer builder can help you to do that. And so on the Learn tab, that's where you're going to really find all of the video lessons. So there's a fast track if you only have 30 minutes before a meeting, and there's a mastery track where the videos go into a little more detail. They're slightly longer. Let's see if we can see some of the examples here. So answering inappropriate questions, how to sell yourself, acing common interview questions, behavioral questions. And then if you go to the practice tab, there's a practice interviews section. So you can actually do a mock interview on this platform. It will use your webcam to record you answering common questions. And then you can see yourself played back. And there's an AI tool that will actually provide you with feedback on things like eye contact, use of filler words, use of keywords like competencies. You can also share your video with Katie and I. So you can share that with us, and then we can give you feedback on your video. So this is really helpful. And just as an example of like the depth of questions that are available, they have questions for all levels from internship to experience. They have questions for every industry that you could imagine. So going into financial services, from financial advisor to private equity to banking. Clicking on banking, they have fit questions, technical questions, logic questions. So this is a fantastic resource. It's really one of my favorites. And then once you do start recording videos, you'll be able to see them here on your My Videos page. There's even a resume tool that can help you put together a resume. We actually refer students to VMock more than we do this one, but I'm sure it's perfectly fine if you want to give it a shot. So I went through that really quickly because we only have about a minute left and I want to make sure we answer all the questions, but happy to go over with this with you in more detail during a one-on-one appointment. And I'll go ahead and put some links in the chat.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. Can you put the link in the chat, please?
Yes, absolutely. All right, here. Okay, so yeah, here's the HireVue resources. I'm going to put the big interview and the tip sheets in the chat, and then we are going to open it up to any remaining questions in our last like 30 seconds or whatever it is.
I wanted to ask, like, if you're having a conversation with someone who's at a company you want to work for, but it's not actually an interview, how much does everything you've said here still apply to that?
Are you referring to an informational interview?
More of I'm connected with someone at this company and I want to talk to them and kind of indicate my interest. Yeah, does that make sense? I guess I've been in the middle of that conversation and realized that it was an interview sort of, and so now I'm going to treat the next ones more that way. But I guess I just was wondering if you have additional advice or different advice for that sort of a context.
To me, that is more of an informational interview.
Okay.
So it can be less formal than what we've talked about in this presentation. For example, I wouldn't expect that you would need like a perfect star story for every question that you're asked. I would also expect that in those conversations, a lot of times you might be driving the conversation more so than the other person. So it's even more important to have some of those good questions prepared. But that being said, the principles of being professional, looking professional, sounding enthusiastic, putting forward your strengths and your best, your best hit stories, those are still important, but it's not quite as formal. And that other person probably doesn't have, typically if you're being interviewed, there's a rubric and a scorecard and you're being rated. And I don't think that any of that is happening.
Gotcha.
But you can certainly make a great impression and get yourself that interview.
Right.
Yeah, I was thinking like the professionalism, the way that you speak, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Just like more of the behavioral stuff would probably really be what comes across. Like the first impression.
And the overall genuine interest of wanting to talk to these folks to learn more.
Great, thank you.
And I think someone had asked about third-party recruiters at the very beginning. Third-party recruiters, it's a very different type of conversation, because their job is to find a good candidate for their client. And so they're really hoping that you fit that bill. So yes, again, same principles apply in terms of professionalism, putting forward your strengths. But it's, I feel like they might be giving you more of a hard sell. And so it's even more important for you to make sure that you understand what the job is and that you're interested in the job, because they're going to be trying to sort of, kind of push it on you, because that's what their client wants, is for them to send candidates. And often if you're contacted by a third-party recruiter, it may not be the right fit. So you just have to make sure you understand what the job is. And then just speak to, if it is something you're interested in, then, sell yourself. They're going to be really open to it. They get paid if you get that job. So they're motivated. I think lastly, someone had asked about, how do we communicate the value of our academic experience? And I think that's a really important question, because as students, no one's really expecting you to have a ton of work experience. So keep that in mind, that it's okay that you've not had a job before, or maybe you haven't even had an internship. But what you want to think about are those transferable skills. So if you're going to talk about a class project, you're going to talk about a research paper, they're not as interested maybe in like the actual subject matter of the research itself as they are in, how did you design the experiment? How did you communicate with participants? What type of writing did you do for that project? What kind of analysis? What tools did you use to analyze the data? So the things that you did as part of that academic assignment that you would actually be doing in a job, because it is really relevant. I mean, there's this misconception that school and industry are two totally different things, but they're really not. Everything you're doing here is preparing you to get a job. And you are all amazing at all of those things. So don't feel like you're lacking because you haven't had actual work experience yet. You're definitely not. All right, I'm sorry we ran over. Does anyone else have questions?
This has been so helpful, Katie and Kristin. Thank you so much for all the preparation that went into this, all the resources you've provided, and the ways that you were able to engage everyone and also answer such a wide range of questions. So we really appreciate your time. There's a bunch of thank yous in the chat as well. For those of you who are here, if you happen to want to talk to friends about what happened today, we will be posting, and we have posted the slides for all of the sessions that we've had this year on the Dietrich graduate student webpage. And today we'll be posting also the recording once it comes to me and I can get that ready to go. So you can direct them there. That's a resource for them as well. And if you have ideas for future topics, we're getting close to starting the planning for next year's series. We do have one more session coming up 2 weeks from now, which is on negotiation. So it's sort of like the next step once you get past the interview and someone wants to offer you a job. So be watching for that. You can register. It's the same kind of process that we've used before. So we look forward to seeing more of you.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks.
you.